live long and prosper. With a raised hand and parted fingers, this greeting has become iconic across the galaxy. The Vulcans, logical, rational, and devoted to the suppression of emotion. But this wasn't always their way. Behind the stoic faces and pointed ears lies a story of transformation, of a civilization that nearly destroyed itself and chose a different path. Today, we're exploring the complete history, mythology, and philosophy of the Vulcan people, from ancient gods and violent warlords, through the time of awakening when Surak changed everything, to their role as humanity's first contact and founding members of the Federation, and finally to their modern challenges as they struggle to maintain relevance in a galaxy that has evolved beyond their philosophy. This is the story of logic born from chaos, peace forged in blood, and a people forever trying to reconcile what they are with what they wish to be. Long before logic ruled their lives, the Vulcans were a deeply spiritual people. According to Vulcan mythology, all creation arose from a place called Sha-Ka-Ri, essentially a Vulcan Garden of Eden, a paradise from which everything began. This mythological origin point represents a time before violence, before the passions that would nearly doom their species. But unlike the Klingons who killed their gods, the Vulcans evolved beyond theirs. Ancient Vulcans practiced polytheism, worshipping gods of war, peace, and death. The Stone of Gaul, an ancient relic, depicts these deities, evidence of a time when Vulcans sought divine guidance for their violent impulses. One such god was Shariel, the god of death, whose image was displayed in Vulcan homes as a reminder of mortality. The planet Vulcan itself shaped its people. Orbiting 40 Eridani A, Vulcan is a harsh desert world with temperatures reaching extremes that would kill most humanoid species. The thin atmosphere, the scorching red sun, the endless deserts, all of it forged a people who were physically stronger, faster, and more resilient than humans. But it also made resources scarce, particularly water, and scarcity breeds conflict. What many don't understand about Vulcans is that their capacity for emotion far exceeds that of humans or most other species. Vulcan emotions are deeper, more intense, more consuming. Their telepathic abilities mean they feel not only their own passions, but can sense the emotions of others, creating a feedback loop that can overwhelm rationality. This combination, extreme emotions, telepathic sensitivity, and a harsh environment, created a perfect storm. By the 4th century on Earth's calendar, approximately 1,800 years ago, Vulcan was drowning in its own blood. The period before Surak is remembered simply as the time of savagery. Vulcan civilization around 2700 BC was barbaric, warlike, aggressive, and savage. Warlords carved out territories, fighting brutal campaigns for water, land, and power. Nuclear weapons scarred the planet. The deserts, already stained red by iron-rich soil, became even redder with green Vulcan blood. The most notorious of these tyrants was Surak. He rose to power by assassinating the previous ruling leader, then used his powerful telepathic abilities to dominate his enemies. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Those who submitted had their minds adjusted through forced telepathic manipulation, making them loyal slaves to his will. His armies conquered most of the homeworld in campaigns of unprecedented brutality. But Surak was just one of many. Countless warlords fought for supremacy, each one willing to burn the world to rule its ashes. Families were torn apart. Cities were destroyed. Knowledge was lost. The Vulcan people stood on the brink of extinction, not from an outside threat, but from themselves. Into this nightmare was born a boy in the city-state of Shurkar. His name was Surak. Surak's family was among the ruling class, targeted by Surak for assassination. He witnessed firsthand the cost of unchecked emotion, the price of allowing passion to dictate action. But unlike others who sought revenge or power, Surak asked a different question. Why? As he matured, Surak became a scientist and philosopher of extraordinary capability. He was compared to Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton, not just for his scientific achievements, but for fundamentally changing how people understood the universe. But his greatest contribution wasn't to science. It was to survival itself. Surak developed a revolutionary idea that logic, not emotion, should govern Vulcan society. Not because emotions were evil, but because they were too powerful, too dangerous for a telepathic species teetering on the edge of annihilation. Surak's philosophy was elegantly simple and impossibly difficult. Master your emotions through logic, or die. He called it Qaeda, the discipline of logic. The foundation was this: emotions exist, emotions are powerful, but they must not control you. Through meditation, mental discipline, and rigid adherence to logical principles, Vulcans could channel their passions into productive pursuits rather than destructive ones. At the heart of Surak's teachings was the concept of IDIC, infinite diversity, in infinite combinations, represented by a pendant showing a circle and triangle adorned with a white jewel. IDIC expressed the Vulcan belief that strength comes from embracing differences, not destroying them. It was a radical notion in a culture that had been slaughtering each other over those very differences for centuries. Surak also introduced the concept of Katra, the living spirit or consciousness of a Vulcan. Through mind melds, a dying Vulcan could transfer their Katra to another, preserving their knowledge, wisdom, and essence. This wasn't mysticism to Surak. It was a practical application of their telepathic abilities, ensuring that hard-won wisdom wouldn't be lost to violence. Surak walked across Vulcan's Forge, the harshest desert region on the planet, beginning at the gateway and crossing the plain of blood. His teachings, recorded in what would become the Kurshara, the original and pure version of his philosophy, slowly began to spread, but But not everyone accepted his message. The transformation wasn't peaceful. Surak's followers clashed with those who rejected logic, who believed that emotion, particularly passion and honor in battle, was what made life worth living. Those who march beneath the raptor's wings, as Surak called them, fought a final, devastating war with the rest of Vulcan. They lost, unable to accept Surak's teachings, but unwilling to see their people completely destroyed. These dissidents made a choice that would echo through galactic history. They left. Boarding primitive spacecraft, they abandoned Vulcan entirely, eventually settling on distant worlds. They would become the Debrun, and most significantly, the Romulans, keeping their emotions, their passion, and their warrior culture, while their cousins on Vulcan chose a different path. Surak himself died during this conflict, apparently from radiation poisoning following a nuclear attack. But before his death, his katra was transferred into a crystalline vessel, where it would remain hidden for nearly 2,000 years. His death came shortly before the final battle, but his ideas survived him. The wars ended. The nuclear weapons were dismantled, and slowly, painfully, Vulcan began to rebuild. According to Ambassador Soval, it took nearly 1,500 years after the time of awakening for Vulcan to rebuild and achieve interstellar travel again. 15 centuries to undo the damage that unchecked emotion had caused. But victory came with a price. The truth was lost. Over the centuries, Surak's original teachings became corrupted. The Kurshara, the artifact containing the pure, unaltered record of his philosophy, vanished from history, hidden away and forgotten. What remained were interpretations, modifications, and politically convenient versions of his message. A monastic order called the Kalinaru Mindlords, once violent telepaths who had nearly destroyed the planet themselves, embraced Surak's teachings and developed an extreme version called Kalinar. If Surak taught the mastery of emotion, Kalinar sought the complete purging of all feeling. Those who sought Kalinar would spend 2 to 6 years, sometimes much longer, in quasi-monastic training at remote sanctuaries. The ritual involved casting out every remaining emotion, achieving a state of pure logic where the need for emotional control no longer existed because emotions themselves were gone. Very few achieved this state. Even Spock, perhaps the most famous Vulcan in history, would attempt Kalinar in the 2270s and fail when the consciousness of V'ger-stirred emotions he thought he'd purged. But Kalinar wasn't the biggest problem. By the 22nd century, the Vulcan High Command, originally tasked only with space exploration, had taken over all functions of government. The Vulcans of the High Command had become arrogant, insular, and suspicious. They felt superior to other races, particularly the emotional species they encountered. Worse, they routinely lied, withheld information, and meddled in the affairs of other civilizations. all things Surak would have considered deeply illogical. Administrator Valas, the leader of the High Command in the 2150s, was secretly working with Romulan agents to provoke a war with the Andorian Empire based on falsified intelligence. When a movement called the Cyrenites arose in 2137, claiming to follow the true path of Surak, Valas saw them as a threat. The Cyrenites' leader, Siren, had discovered the ancient Catric Ark containing Surak's Catra itself. Siren became the vessel for Surak's consciousness, and the movement grew around the goal of returning Vulcan to the true teachings of logic and pacifism. Valas responded by bombing their encampment at the Ta Kerath sanctuary, attempting to kill them all. But he failed. Captain Jonathan Archer of the Earth starship Enterprise, carrying Surak's Catra after Siren's death, delivered the Kurshara to the High Council. The revelation was explosive. For centuries, the Vulcan government had claimed to follow Surak while perverting his teachings for political gain. The discovery of the Kurshara sparked what became known as the Vulcan Reformation. Valas was removed from power, the High Command was dissolved, and Ta Pau, the Cyrenite leader, helped establish a new government actually committed to Surak's true philosophy. This reformation fundamentally changed Vulcan's approach to other species, making them less arrogant and more genuinely logical in their dealings. It would prove crucial for what came next. On April 5th, 2063, everything changed for both Vulcans and humans. The Vulcan survey ship Ta Planahath was on a routine mission near the Sol system when its sensors detected something extraordinary. A warp signature. A species on the planet Earth, a species the Vulcans had been monitoring, but considered decades away from warp capability, had just achieved faster-than-light travel. Dr. Zephram Cochrane had launched the Phoenix, Earth's first warp-capable vessel, built from an old nuclear missile in the aftermath of World War III. The Vulcans diverted to Earth and made first contact with humanity, becoming the first extraterrestrial species humans had ever encountered. It should have been the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It wasn't. The Vulcans decided to help Earth rebuild from World War III and develop warp technology properly. Unlike their approach to other species, they stayed for a century, providing guidance, technology, and mentorship. But their methods were problematic. The Vulcans of the early 22nd century were the corrupt version before the Reformation. They held humanity back, believing humans were too emotional, too volatile, too immature to be trusted with advanced technology. They withheld information about other species. They secretly maintained surveillance operations. They interfered in human development in ways that frustrated Earth's scientists and explorers. When Captain Jonathan Archer and the Enterprise NX-01 finally launched in 2151, capable of Warp 5, with minimal Vulcan assistance, the relationship was strained. Vulcan Science Officer Topal was assigned to the Enterprise, officially to provide guidance, but really to keep an eye on these emotional humans who might cause interstellar incidents. And they did cause incidents, but not in the way the Vulcans expected. Archer and his crew exposed the Vulcan spy station, hidden beneath the ancient Pagem monastery, revealing to the Andorians that the Vulcans had been using a sacred site to spy on them. Later, Archer mediated a ceasefire between Vulcans and Andorians over the disputed colony of Pan Makar, achieving through diplomacy what centuries of Vulcan arrogance had failed to accomplish. Most significantly, Archer carried Surak's Katra and helped spark the Vulcan Reformation, fundamentally changing Vulcan society for the better. The relationship between Earth and Vulcan transformed from suspicious oversight to genuine partnership. And that partnership would be tested by fire. By 2154, the Romulan Star Empire saw the growing cooperation between Earth, Vulcan, Andoria, and Teller as a threat, using advanced drone ships piloted remotely by telepathic Enar. The Romulans launched what became known as the Babel Crisis. The drone ships could disguise themselves as vessels from any species, spreading paranoia and distrust. They attacked Andorian ships while appearing to be Tellarite vessels, and vice versa, attempting to reignite ancient conflicts. But Captain Archer did something the Romulans didn't expect. He brought everyone together. Despite their historic animosities, Earth, Vulcan, Andoria, and Teller formed a joint task force, 128 ships working together under human coordination to hunt down the drone ships. It was the first major allied operation between these four powers, and it succeeded. The Romulans' plan had backfired spectacularly, bringing their enemies closer together instead of tearing them apart. In 2155, representatives from Earth, Vulcan, Andoria, Teller, and other worlds convened to discuss forming a coalition of planets. The proposal faced opposition from xenophobes on every world, but the benefits of cooperation had become undeniable. Then the Romulans escalated. In 2156, open war broke out between the coalition and the Romulan Star Empire. The Earth-Romulan War lasted 4 brutal years, fought entirely over subspace radio without visual communication. Neither side saw the other's faces, keeping the Romulans' connection to Vulcans a secret. In 2160, the Allied forces achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Charon. The Romulan defeat was total and humiliating. The war ended with the establishment of the Romulan neutral zone, a buffer region that neither side would cross. And in 2161, 1 year after the war's end, the old allies made it official. On Earth, in San Francisco, representatives from United Earth, the Confederacy of Vulcan, the Andorian Empire, and the United Planets of Teller signed the Articles of Federation. The United Federation of Planets was born, with Jonathan Archer, the human who had exposed Vulcan corruption, mediated their conflicts, and united them against a common enemy as its first president. The Vulcans were no longer the dominant power in their region. They were partners, equals in an alliance of diverse species. For a people who had struggled with arrogance, it was a difficult adjustment, but it was also, in its own way, very Surakian. Infinite diversity in infinite combinations applied on an interstellar scale. For over 2 centuries, the Vulcans were model Federation members. Their science academies became renowned throughout known space. The Vulcan Science Academy was where the best and brightest studied physics, astrophysics, quantum mechanics, and technologies that pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Vulcan ambassadors served as mediators in countless disputes, their logical approach helping resolve conflicts peacefully. Figures like Ambassador Surak represented Vulcan ideals at the highest levels of Federation diplomacy. His marriage to human Amanda Grayson and their son, Spock's eventual career in Starfleet, symbolized the deep integration of Vulcan and human cultures. But cracks were forming. The 23rd and 24th centuries brought new challenges that tested Vulcan philosophy. A group called the Va-Tashkater, Vulcans without logic, emerged, arguing that Surak's teachings had gone too far. They believed Vulcans should embrace their emotions rather than suppress them. While most remained on Vulcan, some left aboard ships like the Vaklas in 2143, seeking a different path. Then there was Sibok, Spock's half-brother, who rejected Kholinar entirely. He believed that Vulcans needed to confront their emotions, experience them fully, rather than purge them. In the 2280s, he led a group of followers on a doomed quest to find Sha-Kari, the mythological source of creation, believing it would provide enlightenment. His rejection of Surak's core teachings was seen as heresy by most Vulcans. More troubling were signs that Vulcan philosophy was becoming dogmatic rather than truly logical. The pursuit of logic had become, in some ways, illogical, a rigid adherence to rules, rather than flexible adaptation to circumstances. Young Vulcans questioned whether complete emotional suppression was necessary, or if their ancestors had overcorrected. The Vulcan Science Academy, once open to new ideas, became increasingly conservative. When Spock applied in the 2250s, they accepted him, but made derogatory comments about his human heritage, hardly logical, and deeply revealing of lingering prejudice. By the 24th century, anti-Kholinar demonstrations were occurring on worlds like Aclean VII, suggesting that even within Vulcan culture, there was growing discontent with the extremes of their philosophy. In the 2360s, Ambassador Spock took on a mission that many considered treason: Romulan reunification. Spock traveled covertly to Romulus, working with underground movements that sought to embrace logic and reunite with their Vulcan cousins. For Spock, this was the ultimate expression of IDIC and Surak's teachings, recognizing that Vulcans and Romulans were the same species, artificially divided by an ancient schism. The Romulan government tried to exploit Spock's mission for an invasion of Vulcan, but the plot was exposed. Still, Spock continued his work, planting seeds that would take centuries to bear fruit. He believed that eventually logic would triumph and the two peoples would reunite. He never lived to see it in his own timeline. In an alternate reality created by time travel, what became known as the Kelvin timeline, Vulcan, met an apocalyptic fate. In 2387, in the prime timeline, the Romulan star went supernova, threatening to destroy Romulus and surrounding systems. Ambassador Spock volunteered to use red matter, a substance that could create black holes, to contain the supernova. But he arrived too late. Romulus was destroyed, along with billions of Romulans. A Romulan named Nero, who had lost his wife and unborn child in the disaster, blamed Spock and the Federation for not doing enough. Both Nero's mining ship and Spock's vessel were pulled into the black hole created by the red matter, sending them back in time. Nero arrived in 2233, attacking the USS Kelvin and creating an alternate timeline. He waited 25 years for Spock to arrive, then enacted his revenge. In 2258, Nero drilled to Vulcan's core and dropped red matter into the planet, creating an artificial black hole that consumed the entire world. 6 billion Vulcans died in minutes. Spock's mother, Amanda Grayson, was among the casualties. Of the entire Vulcan species, only about 10,000 survived, those who happened to be off-world or were evacuated at the last moment. Ambassador Spock, stranded in this alternate timeline, helped the survivors establish New Vulcan, a colony world where they could rebuild their civilization. He remained there for the rest of his life, guiding his people and keeping Surak's teachings alive even as they faced extinction. The younger Spock of that timeline, having watched his homeworld die, chose to remain in Starfleet, helping to forge a new future for his people as part of the Federation. But in the prime timeline, the original continuity, the story took a different turn. By the 32nd century, over 900 years after Surak's time of awakening, the unification Spock had dreamed of finally came to pass. Vulcans and Romulans came together, and their unified homeworld was renamed Nivar. But this reunification came with complications. When the burn destroyed most dilithium in the galaxy in 3069, causing warp drives across known space to explode simultaneously, the Federation was shattered. Nivar, like many worlds, withdrew from the Federation, choosing isolationism over cooperation. When the USS Discovery arrived from the past in 3189, they found a Federation reduced to a fraction of its former size. and Nivar deeply skeptical of re-establishing ties. The Vulcans and Romulans living together on Nivar had achieved the dream of unity, but at the cost of abandoning the other dream, infinite diversity in infinite combinations applied across countless species. Eventually, through logic and evidence, Nivar was convinced to rejoin the Federation. But the fact that they had withdrawn at all suggested something troubling. That Vulcan philosophy, for all its strengths, could become insular when pushed to extremes. So what does the future hold for the children of Surak? The Vulcans saved themselves from extinction through logic, transforming from violent savages into the most rational species in the known galaxy. Their philosophy gave them centuries of peace, scientific achievement, and cultural stability. But the story of the Vulcans is also a cautionary tale about the limitations of any single approach to life. Surak's teachings were necessary, essential, even for a species as passionate and telepathic as the Vulcans. Complete emotional chaos would have destroyed them. But somewhere along the way, the medicine became a cage. The suppression of emotion became so rigid that Vulcans struggled with the simple joys and connections that make life meaningful. The Va-Tosh Katter Sibak, even Spock himself, all questioned whether the Vulcan path was truly the only logical one. Even in Star Trek Discovery, when Vulcan and Romulan culture merged into Nivar, it suggested that perhaps both sides of their ancient schism had something to teach the other. Logic without passion lacks motivation. Passion without logic leads to chaos. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between. The Vulcans gave humanity first contact, helped build the Federation, and showed the galaxy that peace was possible even for a species capable of terrible violence. But they also showed that no philosophy, no matter how logical, can account for every variable of existence. As Spock, a man forever caught between two worlds, once observed, logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. The followers of Surak walk a narrow path between what they were and what they strive to be. They've walked it for nearly 2 millennia, and they'll likely walk it for millennia more. Their greatest challenge isn't from outside threats, but from within, the eternal question of how much of themselves they must sacrifice to remain logical, and whether that sacrifice is itself logical. Peace and long life to them all. They earned it through fire and blood, and they maintain it through discipline and wisdom. And in the end, perhaps that's the most logical approach of all. Live long and prosper,